And as always, thank you for the silence, for resting, abiding. We could say the core of my invitation is that, to just rest, to stop. When you stop, silence is. When you stop, awareness is, presence is. So this is the direct path. Just rest, just stop, just abide. Stop trying, stop efforting, just be. If that invitation's a little too direct and simple, then ask the question, what is aware in this moment? What am I? Where is stillness? What is watching? What is looking out of my eyes in this moment? Just a reminder to back up. And then when you touch into that, again, just rest. And of course, when you rest there, that space gives off a presence, so you can feel the presence. It's like a flower that's giving off a fragrance. The fragrance is presence, is peace, is love, is a joy, well-being. And so this is the transcendent witness, the spaciousness. It's the seer. And I talk a lot about embodiment and about working with contractions and working with emotions. But whenever I do, if I say it or not, the foundation is that space. Otherwise, it's just the mind doing it. But when I talk about working with emotions from the level of space, it's not really us as a mind or a person that's doing the embodiment, that's doing the work, that's working with emotions. On some level, it's as if we're trying to get out of the way and relax so that this awareness can look through our mind, can look through our emotions, and touch the emotions. And in the touching is a transmutation that happens, a dissolving. And so in much the same way, I encourage you to listen with that space right now. Because everything that I say, really what I'm attempting to do is to speak through your mind, so that the beingness behind your mind can hear. That's really why we gather in satsang. No other reason. It's so that space speaks to that space, wakes up to that space. It's a self-recognition. That's all that we are, all of us. We're that one thing. And it's a living truth. It's not a concept. So this is why I often say all these words are commentary on that. The real teaching is the being of that. And not, again, not just as a concept or as a, I don't know, a non-dual or a new age spirituality, like a catchword. Like, I'm serious. Rest there. Wake up to that. It's possible. And it's much simpler than the mind could ever imagine. But we just have to be patient. And if you forget, then remind yourself. Go back to that. We could say on some level it embodies into the system. It's as if the entire mind, body, emotions, energy system begins to become saturated with that presence. So there's a rewiring that goes on, we could say. And the waking up is not in time and space, it's outside of time and space, but this process is within time and space. A lot of the non-dual pointings are pointing towards awareness, the witness, the backward step, getting out of the mind, out of the me, transcending it, transcending it, transcending it. And on some level, that pointing to that perspective is quite easy. Because basically all you have to say is, whatever's arising, that's not it. Back up. Not this, not this. But this truth that we are, it's non-dual, meaning that everything is it. So ultimately we recognize that when we back out of experience, that's a perspective, one of many. It's a non-dual state, but it's a state. And what is it a state of? And in that state of witnessing, how is that possibly non-dual? Because you're resting as that, and there's the world, there's experience. What's the world? What's experience? Is it part of that? Well, you may or may not recognize that, but if you don't, how can that be non-dual? How can that be oneness? So ultimately, oneness is the collapse of that separation. Most people can't jump to that directly. They need to go through the awakening to the witness. And then somewhere in there, there's an embodiment process where the witness collapses into the witnessed. The transcendent witness recognizes its sameness with the world. Ramana Maharishi would often share the ancient wisdom of the aphorism, the world is illusion. Brahman, or the ultimate reality, alone is. That's the witness. But the third part of the saying is the world is Brahman, meaning this. So ultimately, when this process completes itself in a person and they say, I am that, that refers to everything. Manifest and unmanifest. Same. There's no distinction. And this, of course, is not a concept, it's not a belief, it's a direct experience, it's an insight, direct insight, a seeing, a being. And so we could say on some level that's embodiment on the level of experience, because it's a more holistic, it's a truer experience of truth, we could say, of reality. Ultimately, truth and reality is not touchable by experience or concept. They can be guides and there can be certain experiential signposts that unfold for a person. But ultimately, there's a place where you can fall completely out of experience, out of concept, out of consciousness. But even with that, how does that translate into your moment-to-moment life? How does that look and manifest as a liberated life? In our everyday life? Being triggered, interacting with people, getting cut off in traffic, people pissing us off. How does that manifest there? So this is often where I spend a lot of time sharing and working with people of how do you work with contractions? Because we can have, whether our seeing and our being and our glimpsing of truth is more gradual or quick, meaning if it's more of a It just kind of seeps into our system and we don't recognize it almost until we look back and it's like, hey, yeah, no, I know what that guy's talking about. Or if it's just boom, something just cracks and snaps in you and it's unmistakable. It doesn't really matter ultimately. But the translation of that is when you begin to recognize yourself as that, you can approach your experience much differently now. And of course, you have to, it's one thing to glimpse that and then to forget that and go back into mind, but it's quite another when that becomes more of an abiding experience, so that when emotions and contractions arise, even with that pressure and that triggering, something stays open, an aperture stays open, and then in that opening, something else is looking at the emotion, at the contraction. Not the mind, not the contracted fear, identity. It's the unconditioned identity, we can say, the unborn nature. And the thing about the unborn, about the unconditioned, is that everything it touches, it turns into itself. So when the unborn touches something, it turns the born into the unborn. It turns the conditioned into the unconditioned. That's the power of transmutation, transformation. So I often say to people working with contractions, there's the waking up movement, the waking up and out movement into the transcendent witness, into the space. And then eventually you'll recognize there's this movement down and in. And as it goes down and in, that's more where the oneness is seen. As it goes deeper, that's where no self beyond consciousness is seen. But on the level of just everyday contractions, we can say this drilling down, this embodiment movement, it's piercing through the mind or the conceptual layer of experience, the emotional, the heart level of experience, and deeper the root, kind of the core contractions. Right at the root is this mechanism that the Buddha saw 2,500 years ago, attachment aversion. That's what identity is. Not conceptually, you can feel it. When you're sensitive, you can feel it. That part in you that just moves towards an experience, I like that, I want that, and moves away. I don't like that. Aversion. Fear. But as we rest as that space, and as that space moves down through the concept, through the narrative, we can say, which tends to be where more of the psychological work takes place, the narrative, talking about our story, our wounds, our traumas. And it's necessary on some level. If that's never been looked at, it needs to be seen, it needs to be heard. Needs to be processed. But I'm talking about a space when you're ripe and ready, where you're not so interested in your narrative anymore. And you have to have seen it first, you have to have been with it, otherwise it's just a dissociation and a denial, a repression. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where you've worked through it, you've looked at it, and you've gotten to a point where it's like, okay, I'm just analyzing it, and it's the same old story with different guises, and I'm really, what else is there? That's what I'm talking about, and that in that place you can drop into a more fundamental place, which is just feeling the emotions, going directly into them, not analyzing them. Yes, you have traumas, and we have our narrative. If we're alive in this world, we have traumas. This is the world we live in. That's just the truth. Not the absolute, but on the relative level. We live in a pretty violent world. Whether it's physically, but I'm talking just emotionally. Most of us just don't live wide open with each other. That's not how relationships are right now on the planet. It's changing, but this is where we are right now. But as we dip directly into the emotions, to feeling them without analysis, there's such a power in that, because in the direct feeling, what's actually happening on a more psychological explanation is experiences are being metabolized. Because in essence, what the unconscious is, or what contracted emotions are emotions and experiences that couldn't be fully felt at some point in our life. And so when we drop into those places directly, with space, with presence, because the mind can't do it, but as presence, as body presence, aliveness, energy, we can go into it with that. And what happens when we allow it is we now feel it. We feel what couldn't be felt before. And so experiences are completing themselves, emotions are being felt, energy is being dissipated now. Because when we fully feel it, we no longer have to repress it. We're no longer afraid of it. So it can pass through and drop out of our system, which frees up even more energy of awareness and presence to drop even deeper, because it's now unhooked from constantly cycling and repressing in our psyche. Now that can return back to its unconditioned nature and allow us to embody deeper. And the body is very connected with this process. I love the body as a portal. Firstly, as a meditation portal, we could say, as a portal into presence, into resting, into abiding, but also as a transmutation and transformation vehicle, which is more along the lines of body-centered psychotherapy, we could say, which trauma therapy, body therapy, body psychology, it really understands the necessity to accessing the intelligence and the presence of the body to heal. And ultimately it's the same, because ultimately presence is what heals, period. That's the healer. I don't care what modality you use, what's doing the healing is presence. And whatever you're doing will be more effective with presence. So resting in the body naturally creates presence. The body is presence. Most of us experience the body as very solid, very contracted, but it's actually nothing. It's pure presence. Everything's pure presence. So when we rest in the body starts coming alive, we could say, waking up, melting open, relaxing open. And of course this can be sometimes disorientating, because as it opens, it releases its traumas, it releases its contractions, it releases its toxins, its negativity. But we're going into the body with presence. And presence allows that. It opens to that. And so this is more of, we could say, more of the feminine teaching of welcome emotions, feel emotions, open to emotions, feel, feel, feel. Don't just transcend, feel, feel. Ultimately, feeling takes us to transcendence. But there's a way where we can go into transcendence as a hideout, as an escape, as a dissociation. So moving into emotions, moving into the body is the counterbalance to that teaching and that perspective. And of course, we could say we're moving into emotions, which is more of the heart, we could say. But really, the body and the heart really aren't two. When I use the word heart, really, it's the heart of everything. So ultimately, we could say the heart is closer to truth than the head. But deeper, we could say the body But at the essence of what I'm speaking about, the heart of everything is nothing.
Great, can I just say ask some? So
I'm just on a flow here, so let me finish.
All right.
I can't create this when this happens.
Okay.
So the heart of everything is nothing, and out of the nothing comes the divine qualities, comes the love, comes the presence. There's a way where we can distinguish the two, but they're really so overlaid upon each other. The only real utility to separating the two is almost as a teaching function, and a way to really drop into no self. No self being the place of non-fixation that allows us to flow into all states, non-dual, contracted. And it's a funny thing because most of us would assume that we can go into a non-dual state, and when we do, this is the thing about truth, when we tap into any facet of truth, it feels like the whole story. It's like a fractal. Everything's contained in the drop. And yet, we just never know until the pressure of life pushes us. Then we'll know how deep the awakening has really gone. And so when I make these distinctions of head, heart, gut, deepening levels of embodiment, and when I talk about no self, or the root, I'm talking about a very subtle place. And I know through my own direct experience, there is a place to go into oneness and abide as that, and there's still to be a subtle center. And so when I point towards this place of no self, which is more, we could say, centered in the root, meaning root chakra, body, matter, the earth element, solidity, stickiness, and ultimately when we're talking about working with emotions and really translating that self-liberating quality of consciousness in our moment-to-moment existence, we're talking about really contracted, sticky, dark emotions. And that's where that level of the recognition and realization is of utmost importance. That allows you to flow and to navigate there without getting stuck. And of course, there's a way to look at the embodiment process moving into the unconscious. But ultimately, where this process is going is that the so-called unconscious becomes conscious. And when the unconscious becomes conscious, it frees up a lot of energy. And this energy can be translated into many things. Sometimes spiritual powers will come to us, or not. But however it manifests, what will happen is the mind will begin to function differently, more clarity. Random thoughts begin to dissipate. Thinking is more functional. Likewise, the heart is not so heavy, it's light. So a lot of love flows through. Unconditioned heart, true nature flowing through the heart is love. True nature flowing through the mind is clarity, space. And then likewise the body becomes more energetic, alive. Everything's alive. The senses become alive. The visual field becomes clear, sounds are clear, beautiful things are more beautiful. And the simple human existence becomes extraordinary. Not because it's great, Not because it's perfect or extravagant by any of the mind's interpretations, but just because it is. So there's naturally a compassion and an empathy that flows. Not because you're trying to be loving, trying to be compassionate. It's just you recognize that everything is that. And it breaks your heart because you know it's possible. And you know how simple it is. And yet you see another, a so-called other, that isn't seeing and experiencing that. That's the compassion I'm talking about. That's the service I'm talking about. That's where it becomes not your own awakening anymore. It's more about what can that space do through you? And it's not a saving the world mentality. That's all mind. I'm talking about when you're out of control of your own life. Your personal will is dissolved. And don't let the mind take that and make it into something. It's very simple. It's just what is calling you in this moment? What's alive for you in this moment? And you'll begin to discriminate between your mind's and your personal will and this, we could say, divine will. Let's not even call it divine. Let's just call it this energy force that's pushing you in that direction because you know that it's true. You can feel its truth. And you don't care what it feels like. You just know that it's true. That's what I'm talking about. So that's the translation of the recognition and the realization into the truth of the moment. The translation of our recognition of true nature into the moment-to-moment living of our human life. And of course, initially that saturates our personal experience, and eventually that moves into the world, into relationship. And so we don't have to worry about saving the world. It happens spontaneously. We just have to be simple, rest, abide, and be. And the rest will take care of itself.